Welcome to the Savvy Podcasting for Entrepreneurs podcast, a place for podcasters to learn what's actually working in the world of podcasting and how to use their podcast to generate consistent leads in their business. I'm your host, Jenny, and I'm so excited you're here. Hey Savvies, welcome back to another episode of the podcast. I'm super excited that you're here, and if we're being completely honest, I kind of wanted to skip recording this week because I'm really congested and sniffly. Obviously, you can probably tell, and no one really wants to hear that, but consistency is super important. So I'm committing to my weekly release schedule, even though I don't sound great. So please bear with me here. I'll try to make it short and sweet so you don't have to hear me rambling on with a stuffy nose for a long time. So anyway, in today's episode, we're going to be chatting all about Podfade. So what that is and how to avoid it, because it can definitely happen if we're not careful. So first up, what is Podfade? So Podfade is just when a show suddenly stops releasing new content without making like a final announcement episode and basically just fades off into oblivion. So many podcasts experience Podfade. It's crazy, especially I know in 2020, so many people started podcasts and then they realized how much work it was, and then they fell off the map with it. And I found a crazy stat that said most podcasts don't make it past their 7th episode, which is just insane because 7 episodes is you release with 2 or 3 like you should with a launch. That's only additional like 3 to 4 episodes. So that's like an extra month worth of content, which is just insane to me to put all this effort in and then fall off face of the earth. So I really don't want that to be the case for you guys, whether you're on your 7th episode or your 100th episode. And there are some instances where it's okay to just stop your podcast. I'm not saying never stop recording episodes, kind of impossible. We don't know what we're going to be doing in a year from now, 2 years from now. But if you decide to go a different direction with your business or your podcast no longer aligns with your vision, then it's totally okay to rebrand and start fresh with a new podcast or completely stop altogether. But the main thing is, I just think it's really important to give your audience a heads up before you completely quit releasing new episodes. Don't just never talk about it. So it's just really key to let people know that you're not going to be putting out new episodes on that podcast anymore. Don't just completely ghost. So now that you know what Podfade is, let's talk about how we can avoid it from the get-go. So I have 5 tips for you to avoid Podfade. So number 1 is to come up with at least 6 months worth of content ideas before your podcast is even launched. So if you can't come up with 6 months worth of topic ideas, then you may not have enough content to have a consistently weekly podcast. So I want you to keep that in mind. But having 6 months or more worth of topic ideas, this will really help you get into a good momentum, a good flow going with your episode ideas. And a lot of the time will help you continue to spark new ideas as you're going through. So I actually do this 1 to 2 times a year, just sit down and map out a ton of different topic ideas. And typically I always get at least a year's worth of episode ideas, if not more, which a year is, if you're releasing weekly, that's 52 weeks. I typically skip Christmas week and Thanksgiving week. So that's 50 weeks of content. So 50 ideas. So you should be able to at least get 25 ideas, if not 50, because you need to make sure that you have enough content to have this consistent weekly podcast. So that's number 1. Number 2 is that you need to batch record at least a month's worth of content in advance, if not more. Like a month is a minimum, because that gives you a chance to have stuff for the month, and then you'll go and record another month and you'll always be a month ahead. So a big factor that stops people from releasing weekly episodes is that they don't have anything pre-recorded in advance. So they're flying by the seat of their pants and having to squeeze recording a new episode into their schedule every single week. So it eventually just ends up falling off the list because they have to squeeze in a recording and then they have to edit and then write show notes. So eventually there's, I don't have time for this, because they're having to do everything in a week, versus if they had it recorded, then it would just be the post-production process. Number 3, choose a format that works for you. So whether that's releasing episodes every single week or even every other week, choose a schedule that you can stick to and be consistent with. This will really help keep you on track. And if you're doing weekly episodes and you can commit to that, totally fine. If you can't commit to weekly episodes, don't don't set yourself up for failure by doing that from the beginning. You can always go up, like work your way back up to weekly episodes, but don't start with weekly and then not be able to keep up and then fall off the face of the earth. That's just not a good strategy. So just pick a format that works for you and stick with it. Okay. Number 4, go into the whole podcast launch process, just your podcast in general, with your goals in mind. Because I feel like so many people start podcasts, but they don't take the time to really lay the foundation for why they're even starting their podcast in the first place. They're just, I want to start a podcast. That sounds cool, but they don't really have any like goals behind it, or they don't know what kind of goals or metrics they need to measure for it to be successful. So this is just really a crucial step to ensure that your podcast really aligns with your goals for your business. Because obviously, if you're just putting out content for the sake of putting out content, that's not going to do good for you, your audience, or anyone. So I think that's really important. Just keep your goals in mind and always reevaluate those goals. If your goals change, that's totally fine. You can totally shut down your podcast if you don't feel like it's working anymore. But the only thing I ask is that you leave with an announcement episode. Just let them know you're not going to be putting out episodes any longer and where to find you. It's just super simple. You don't have to stay with it forever, but you definitely need to have an ending to it so people feel that closure essentially. And then lastly, you need to be prepared in all aspects. So when starting your podcast, you should acknowledge the time investment that it will take, especially if you're going to be the one doing all the things when it comes to the podcast. So if you're not only recording, but you're doing the editing and the show notes and the graphics and the social media post and all that stuff. So make sure you have extra time in your schedule to accommodate this so that you don't spend all this time putting your podcast together, launching your podcast, and end up only lasting like 2 to 3 months because it's just too much work to handle on your own and you can't afford to outsource parts of it. I would even say something like editing is hanging you up and you can afford to outsource just the editing piece. That will save you so much time. So I definitely recommend doing that if you can. Swing it, because that will really help you stick on track, because the show notes you can pull from transcripts. It doesn't, and your show notes don't need to be anything super fancy when you're first starting out. So just be prepared for all the time and energy that comes from having a podcast, but it's really so worth it in the end. And I think you're going to love it if you haven't started your podcast already. And if you have, and you feel like you're experiencing some of these things, like you didn't know how the time investment was going to take, just take a step back, take a hiatus. It's okay if you take a week or 2 off. Just gather your thoughts and get prepared so that you can continue releasing new episodes if it's something you really enjoy doing. If it's not, you don't have to have a podcast. That's okay. But if it's something you really enjoy doing, then make it a priority. So yeah, I want to know though, have you had a podcast that you absolutely loved, fallen off the face of the earth without having a goodbye episodes essentially? I'd love to know. Send me a DM on Instagram at jenny.suneson. So jenny.suneson. And even if you've ever done this yourself too, or had a show you love, do that. Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Totally fine. It happens. I don't fault you for it. But now that you know that you should have this kind of closure episode, now going forward, that's something we should all make a priority. So yeah, that's it for today's episode. If you want to check out the show notes, you can go to savvypodcastingforentrepreneurs.com, and I'll see you in the next episode.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast player like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Stitcher, and leave a review. You can find us at savvypodcastingforentrepreneurs.com and on Facebook at Savvy Podcasting for Entrepreneurs and Instagram at Savvy Podcasting. Make sure to join our free Facebook community for podcasters by going to savvypodcastingforentrepreneurs.com/community and join in on the exclusive community just for Savvy Podcasting for Entrepreneurs listeners. I'll see you there.